The night had fallen, and the air in the neighborhood grew cold. I sat alone in my office, the light from the computer screen illuminating my tired face. Then, I heard a strange sound coming from the house across the street, the house where I hadn't seen anyone in months. It wasn't a normal sound. It was something different. The clattering of objects, footsteps, but not the sound of an ordinary family. It was the sound of something not belonging to this world. Deep sighs, faint whispers echoed from inside. I felt confused, but I couldn't stop myself. I stood up and looked out the window. The house across the street still stood silent in the darkness, but I had the feeling someone was watching me from inside. My eyes couldn't leave the window, where a dim light from within the house cast a narrow beam onto the ground. And then, I saw something unbelievable. A pair of eyes, dark and filled with hatred, were staring at me through the window of the house across the street. Those eyes didn't belong to a human. They belonged to something hiding in the shadows. My heart tightened, but I couldn't look away. Those eyes weren't just glaring in anger, but with something deeper, as if they were piercing through my mind, pulling me into an endless abyss. I couldn't explain the feeling, but at that moment, I understood that I was being sucked into something beyond my control. I closed my eyes, trying to shake off the heavy feeling, but it wouldn't leave. When I opened my eyes again, those eyes were still there, and this time, they weren't just staring at me. It felt as if they were searching for something within me. An exploration, an intrusion. Suddenly, a thought crossed my mind, making me shudder. Could this house have once been the residence of the dead? The souls left behind, unable to leave. And was I seeing those souls unable to find peace, forever trapped in a space they couldn't escape? They weren't staring at me to scare me. They were searching for salvation, a way out of their eternal pain and hatred. My gaze was once again drawn to those eyes, unable to break free. It felt like I was being pulled into a whirlpool, where every step became uncertain and chaotic. A moment ago, I thought it was just my imagination, but now I wasn't so sure. Suddenly, I heard a soft breath from within the house. It wasn't the breath of a human. It was a sound that couldn't be described, as though forgotten souls were calling from deep in the darkness. I turned back to look at the computer screen, only to see my reflection in the window slowly fading, as if someone was standing right behind me. I couldn't explain why, but a cold shiver ran down my spine as I turned around. Just to be sure, I quickly looked behind me, and of course, there was no one standing there. But what about those shadows? What were they trying to do? Were they really just lost souls, or something else? Beings that existed between life and death? I looked back out the window. The house was still there, silent, as if it had been waiting for me all along. And this time, it wasn't just the eyes that were watching me. More shadowy figures appeared, faint and ghostly in the light from the house. A hand, faint but clear, reached out from the darkness toward me. Long, pale fingers, though there was no flesh, only exposed joints. It slid across the window, right before my eyes, startling me. In that moment, I no longer feared the gaze of that creature. It was the invisible terror that engulfed the entire neighborhood. Could this be the beginning of something worse than I ever imagined? In the darkness of the house across the street, the souls unable to rest still lingered, waiting silently. Lost souls, unable to leave, hiding in every dark corner of the house, and I couldn't know whether I would ever escape their call. Since that night, those figures and those eyes would haunt me forever. They weren't just wandering ghosts. They were the souls left behind, unrelenting fears, unerasable crimes. And when I looked into them, I understood that I was facing something worse than death itself. This fear couldn't be escaped. It would erode my mind until I could no longer distinguish what was real from what wasn't. The eyes of that monster weren't the gaze of a mere creature. They were the eyes of something that had died but didn't want to rest. Chapter 2: Damon's Disappearance. The next day, I decided to go out and ask about the house. I was too curious, too confused about the strange things happening right before my eyes. Damon, the only neighbor living in that house, was the only one I could ask. When I arrived at the house, the atmosphere was still gloomy like the night before. The front door was closed, and there were no signs of life inside. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. However, as I turned to leave, I felt something was wrong. The light from inside the house suddenly went out, and I saw Damon's figure standing there, in the darkness, as if he had been waiting for me. Looking for me? Damon asked, his voice low and cold, as though something was controlling him. I nodded, trying to steady my nerves. I just wanted to ask about your house, about what's happening there. He smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. This house has a lot of stories, but not everyone wants to hear them. I felt like I was walking into a trap, but I couldn't leave. So, where did the people who lived here go? I asked. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes inexplicable. Then he whispered, "They all disappeared. I'm the only one left." The atmosphere thickened. I felt like I had just touched a secret no one wanted to know. Damon turned and walked into the house, the very house I had just seen swallowed by the darkness. He didn't invite me in, but I felt an irresistible urge. But I couldn't suppress my curiosity. Something inside me urged me to do something I knew I shouldn't. I followed Damon into the house. The door slammed shut behind us with a loud bang. As soon as I stepped inside, I immediately felt the heaviness of the space, as though the air had been compressed over decades, thick and suffocating. Damon walked ahead, his eyes empty, like a ghost wandering in his own house. I followed, but the deeper we went, the more I felt the presence of something indescribable. The walls were faded, the curtains almost always drawn, blocking the light from the outside, creating a dim, oppressive atmosphere. Then I noticed strange details around the house, the paintings on the walls, but there were no people in them. Each painting was blurry, as though the faces had been worn away by time and neglect. Especially the clocks on the walls. All of them had stopped, their hands frozen at a certain time. "Do you live here alone?" I asked, my voice shaking from the suffocating atmosphere surrounding me. Damon didn't answer immediately, but when he turned to look at me, I saw a fleeting moment of confusion in his eyes. "Something strange." "Not alone," he whispered. "I'm the last one left." I felt this truth slap me in the face. That statement wasn't right. Damon wasn't the last one, at least not in this house. As I was about to ask more, a noise echoed from downstairs, making me jump. Damon didn't seem surprised. He stood still, his eyes like he had grown accustomed to the sound. "That's what's left," he said, his tone flat. I quietly followed Damon down the old wooden stairs. With each step, I felt like thousands of eyes were watching me from the darkness. The footsteps were soft but not harmless. They were waiting to devour everything left in this house. Finally, we stopped in front of an old wooden door. Damon placed his hand on the doorknob, then turned to look at me. "This place isn't meant for the living," he said, his voice hoarse, as though something was stopping him. I could feel the cold emanating from the door, as though something was waiting on the other side. Damon didn't open the door right away, but stood there, his eyes briefly filled with fear I had never seen before. We stood still, and then I began to hear strange sounds from within the room. Whispers, growls, eerie sounds dragging on like an endless nightmare. Finally, Damon turned back, his face pale as if he had just witnessed something unbearable. "That's the place I can't leave," he said weakly. "Where the souls are left behind. Where nothing ever dies." I didn't understand what he meant until the door opened. As the door creaked open, a gust of cold air blew into my face. Inside was a pitch-black space, only faint shadowy figures visible. Ghosts, lost souls, sat around the room, their eyes empty, their gaze like black holes that swallowed all light around them. They didn't say a word. They just stared. The souls trapped in this house, unable to leave, unable to find peace. And now, I began to understand that what Damon had said wasn't nonsense. He wasn't the last survivor. He was the only one who couldn't escape the house's haunting. And now, I had become one of them. Damon turned away, and the darkness quickly swallowed him. The last thing I heard before the door closed was his voice, soft and distant, as though he had already been lost forever. "Don't try to leave. Now, you belong here." I hope this translation meets your expectations. Let me know if you need any further assistance.